This is Judaism Unbound, Episode 31, Designing OneTable. We want to open with a short note to our listeners that the audio quality in part of today's interview is not as good as it usually is on our show. It's not what we generally want to have, and we apologize for it, but we hope that you'll push through the audio in those spots and listen to a great interview. And now, here we go. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofus.
And we're here today with Aliza Kline, who is in the very interesting, rare, maybe unique position of being the founding executive director of two major innovative Jewish organizations in her career. The first one was the Mayyim Mikveh in Boston, where she served as the founding executive director for 10 years, working alongside Anita Diamond, who we spoke to a few months ago, who was one of the other major driving forces behind that organization. And currently, Aliza serves as the founding executive director of OneTable, an organization that is focused on helping people make Friday night dinner a greater part of their Jewish lives. Aliza, in addition to being one of my oldest friends in the business, is somebody who really fits well, in my view, in this series on art and artists, even though she doesn't necessarily think of herself as an artist, doesn't function as an artist. One of the issues that we want to explore here is whether Aliza and Jewish leaders like her are fundamentally looking at Judaism and looking at Jewish institutions the way that artists generally look at the materials that they work on and reshape. So, Aliza, we are thrilled to have you on Judaism Unbound and looking forward to a great conversation. Thanks so much for joining us.
It is my pleasure, Dan.
Great. So over the course of the podcast, we've been talking kind of theoretically about where the Jewish community is today, where Jewish people are today. It's really exciting to have you on the show as somebody who is one of the people on the ground doing this work. And you are, I think, relatively rare in the world of Jewish innovators at this point, because you are now on your second major Jewish innovation, having spent 10 years building Mayyim Hayyim, and then you moved to New York, and you then are now the founding director of the OneTable project. So I guess to start, it would be great to just get a little bit of a sense of sort of the beginning of your work in this area and that particular project, and sort of how you thought about starting a new type of Jewish organization, and particularly interested in the idea that really what you were taking was a very old Jewish ritual, almost one that I would say for liberal Jews had pretty much fallen completely out of use. And so in a sense, you were reaching back into the Jewish well, into Jewish history for something not only to revitalize something that was kind of tired, but actually to revivify something that was in some ways dead.
So talking about mikveh is really one of my very favorite topics. I can do it for days on end, but in an effort to be concise, a mikveh is a gathering of waters. Comes right from the beginning of the Bible and the beginning of Genesis, when the language is that God gathers up the waters. And that gathering, that collection of waters, controls water in a different way. So water, rather than being a source of destruction and fear, when gathered, actually can be a place for renewal and life. So any natural gathering of water, a lake, a stream, an ocean, is certainly a kosher mikveh. But when you collect and build the mikveh yourself, then there are different stringent rules about how you build the mikveh. All of the rules about mikveh relate to its construction, not to who can go in or out. So if you build it with the right materials and in the right size, which really, again, has a minimum, needs to be big enough for an average-sized adult to be able to fully immerse him or herself without having to scrunch up their body. Generally speaking, there are about 7 steps leading into it, and that also helps you provide just the right height.
The idea of creating or recreating a space where people could feel totally comfortable to be their honest, true selves, physically and emotionally and spiritually, was something that people were kind of hungry for and clamoring for, but no one realized that mikveh might be a solution. Mikveh is one of our most mysterious and ancient rituals, comes way from the very beginning, literally introduced the beginning of the Bible, in the beginning of Genesis, where God gathers up the waters. And this primordial water that we can then immerse ourselves in gives us a chance to start over. It should be one of the most inclusive and welcoming spaces. It's literally just a pool of water. And instead, over time, mikveh has become mysterious, hidden, interpreted in terribly misogynistic ways. The idea that when you immerse in a mikveh, you go as God created you in your full naked self, can lead to abuse of the space and the power of who controls it. And so there was not exactly a groundswell of interest to recreate this mikveh. And yet in the early 2000s, I was brought in as a partner with Anita Diamond and a small but mighty group of other women, and then eventually men, who really wanted to reclaim and reinvent this mikveh, this same concept, not by changing the core of what a mikveh is, just a pool of water, but by reframing access to it. Also, by making it a desirable place. Like, what happens if you add in windows, if you add in heated floors, if you add in colors and space that are not gendered but are rather accessible to everybody? What if you add in a lift for someone who can't walk down the stairs but can be lowered gracefully in? What if the person who welcomes you when you come in reflects who you are? If you are a Jew of color, so might be the person who welcomes you in. If you are healing from a painful illness or injury, so might be the person who greets you and welcomes you in. If you are queer and transitioning, converting, celebrating, any of those things, you should be able to be the focus of what happens when you come into a ritual space. And the idea behind Mayyim Hayyim was to really design an entire physical space and program around each person walking in the door or entering into the space. It was an incredible opportunity for me as a professional to both dig deep into our Jewish history and ritual well and find the ritual where people could be the most vulnerable. You're literally physically naked when you immerse, and in order to feel safe and to actually sink, you have to exhale. You have to be calm. And you can't do that if you're scared or uncomfortable or in some way sort of faking who you are. So the idea of creating this space meant the bar had to be incredibly high in terms of sensitivity, in terms of thoughtfulness, and in terms of accessibility. And that for me was like just the very best professional challenge I could ever have. That's the Judaism that I'm looking for, that I am hungry for, and that I firmly believe exists. But it takes a lot of effort and practice to make that happen.
Yeah, so as I was listening to you describe this, I was thinking, like, could you sort of walk us through the steps that you kind of think are going on here from an innovation standpoint that potentially could be abstracted and applied to other areas of Jewish life? And perhaps you're doing that now with Shabbat dinner with OneTable.
The initial motivation from Mayyim Hayyim was absolutely articulated by Anita Diamond, who is a writer and a creator and a passionate advocate for accessible Judaism. Her then fiance converted to Judaism, and the presto changeo moment before you come out as a Jew is to immerse in a pool of water. And she remembers going with him to a mikveh that was clearly not designed for that purpose, and despite being sort of a guest in a foreign space, he was transformed, and so was she as his partner. And it sparked a light. Can you just imagine what that kind of transition and transformation can be like, which is really like a birth, if it were celebrated and honored and a light shone upon it, as opposed to sort of feeling like an interloper in a different space? That was the beginning, really the kernel of thinking about what this ritual could be like. But as I mentioned before, so while there may be hundreds of people converting in each city, and certainly in that was the case in Boston, the idea of people lining up to donate money and create resources for a mikveh was totally non-existent. So the question is, if you approach the creation of a ritual from the perspective of a designer, you want to first know what people need and what they value. What are they looking for? What's missing in their lives? And how are they meeting that gap on their own? And we started talking with people who are looking to mark a transition in their life, which might have the same magnitude even as converting to Judaism, but for which there isn't an obvious ritual. We talked to a lot of people who were dealing with a diagnosis around cancer, or who perhaps, thank God, had become a survivor of it, people who were entering into a new phase of a relationship, whether it's deepening that tie or severing that tie, people who were changing their bodies because of a major weight loss, and really were living in a different way. The number of life changes just kept being listed and repeatedly, and people kept generating more and more and realizing that they were very hungry for a Jewish ritual that had history, weight, integrity, but that was also deeply personal, and one that could help them align all of these parts of their life. So we asked a lot of questions. What were they doing now? How were they meeting those needs? And then began designing the space, the program, the location even of Mayyim Hayyim based on what we were learning from them. Spent a lot of time thinking about what's the role of the person who greets you when you make an appointment online or over the phone or in person. How do you literally go through the experience, and how does it done so that you feel like you're the center of the space? And we started by thinking very carefully about language and aesthetics. We built in an art gallery, but very carefully chose artwork that was not the kind of work that makes you physically uncomfortable. Because in order for this ritual to work, you need to be as physically safe as you can. So this is not cringe-inducing artwork. It's inspiring work in another way. We added in music and had original liturgy written for the rituals that were coming. Everything was done with an absolute eye towards Hidur Mitzvah, towards heightening the beauty of the ritual, so that rather than this being like an ichsa kind of experience, it could be oh, that's beautiful. That's someplace I want to go. And it meant, interviewing several architects and developers and interior designers and writers and so on, so that the space could really resonate with as many people as possible, but also really reflect the concerns that we heard and the questions and desires that we heard from our potential users. They should walk in and feel like, oh, this place was designed for me. And that, I think, was the most wonderful praise we ever heard from people, right? That they would come in and say, I'm coming because I have decided that while I've been living with my partner for a long time, now we want to get pregnant. And so sex is different, and you have a ceremony that absolutely speaks to me. Thank you, right? Like, they might not even say that. They just may express it by looking through the ceremonies that were written specifically for our visitors and find the one that resonates, and then they just smile quietly and take it. So there was everything was, I think, as thoughtfully designed as possible, but also the ability to shift and change quickly. It's a vocabulary I later learned in terms of design thinking, but I think it absolutely applies to everything that we did at Mayyim Hayyim. Some of it seemed intuitive to us, but the mikveh itself, creation and design, is actually so counterintuitive that this is not like based on market research, right? It's not a matter of like, should we build a mikveh, yes or no? Will you pay for it, yes or no? It was a much bigger question about our spiritual and physical and emotional needs, and how the Jewish community and Jewish resources might respond to them.
So one of the pieces that I am really interested in, you talked about how we had to raise $2 million, and there's taking it from a great idea to proving that it's a great idea that's worth investing in more or as much as all the other ideas that could help the Jewish community. And it made me think, because we've been talking about communal needs and individual needs a lot on the podcast. And what I think is so special about Mayyim Hayyim, that not that many Jewish institutions share with it, is that we're talking about meeting a whole bunch of individuals. And I'm curious if you think that that's a piece of why it's so successful, if it's just, a side factor, if it's something that other institutions should be focused on.
There's a lot of conversation about what our community needs, and sort of from up high, as though we can just sort of declare up high that this is what our community needs next. And Mayyim Hayyim is definitely has evolved much more organically than that, right? So there was a particular explicit need that Mayyim Hayyim addresses in its construction and its design, but a lot of what has evolved has been kind of delightfully surprising and also indicative of other needs. So, for example, it was really created very carefully and politically as a complement to existing organizations in the Boston Jewish community. It was something we worked very hard on so that we wouldn't be perceived as threatening, but really as an added benefit. And I think despite that, or maybe because of it, there were a number of individuals, predominantly those who've become our most essential and sacred volunteers, the men and women who become mikveh guides, who really support each individual and who volunteer several hours a week. For many of them, this has become their community. And this has become the place where they feel the most at home, most at safe. They literally become a member of Mayyim. So for those who have created a community where Mayyim has really become their spiritual home, I can think of a specific example where even a personal moment in a loss in someone's life, the Shiva Minyan was made up of other people from the mikveh, right? That they had formed relationships with people who shared these same values and these same connections, and it has actually become for them not only a place of their personal volunteer work or their personal spiritual exercises and practices, but also a sense of community and belonging.
I want to note, I think it's really a fascinating discovery. And I think one of the things that at least I've experienced in my own career is how you discover things that were not your plan. So, for example, you think that you're providing this individual experience for these various people. Turns out that you're actually creating this community of guides, which is, potentially just as important or even more transformative. And I wonder, then down the road, do these guides become inspired to say, hey, and I want to have Shabbat dinners in my house with OneTable, right? So I think like as a transition into your work with OneTable, one of the things that I'm really interested in hearing you describe the work on the mikveh is it's so careful and so thoughtful and takes so long, that it's absolutely overwhelming to think of doing that work for like a whole Jewish community. Instead, what we're seeing, I think, is a modularization. Is a lot of pieces of Judaism being kind of tinkered with separate from their presence in a larger system, where you actually have to tinker with the whole system. Otherwise, that one piece doesn't work, but somehow this work is saying, okay, yeah, we can tinker with mikveh, we can tinker with Shabbat dinner, and other people are tinkering with other pieces. And I'm wondering, first of all, like for you to describe some of what you're doing with OneTable and how that flows from or doesn't flow from the work you did with Hayyim, but then I'm also
flows.
Oh, right.
Nice. Yeah.
Flows. But also then this question of do you see sort of even a larger picture? You in your career, let's say you spend 10 years on everything, you're still only going to be able to tinker with 5 or 6 things. What else? What are we going to do with everything else?
Okay, so if we trust in this human-centered design thing, everything's on the table. That's my table. I've switched from water puns to menus and tables and seats and so on. That's the thing. So first of all, I personally am a ritualist. Like if I have a choice between spending a couple hours learning, studying text versus engaging in a ritual, whether it's meditation or walking or hiking or dancing or praying or singing or immersing or whatever, that's where I go. I have a theory that for many people that's more accessible because it's also universal. Shabbat is my little escape right now from the madness of the world. I really need to not look at any news for a while. And I can because I have to be doing this other ritual. And I can only do one thing at a time. I will also say there's a sort of a broader perspective here. If we are designing for a Jewish practice as opposed to designing for a human need, we will do it differently. So I say this with meaning no disrespect for the folks who have created this alternative, but I just want to question it, right? If you are designing with Shabbat dinner as your goal, like that's what I'm focusing for, and what are the needs of Shabbat dinner? I might come up with items like, you need a challah, you need candles and candlesticks, you need a wine or juice, and you need a beautiful cup to put it in because we have this concept of beautifying the mitzvah, so you should have it in a beautiful glass, and so let's get them a really beautiful glass and maybe a nice cover for the challah, and we could put it all in a box, Shabbat in a box, maybe I'll have a CD with beautiful music. Like, you can think of all the different things that would really enhance and create this experience, and just pick it up and take it on and put it out, and now you're done. However, I'm not designing for that. I'm designing for the person. So if I'm designing for the person, I have a whole other set of questions. With OneTable, the very big difference. So first of all, I was 29 when I was lucky enough to meet Anita Diamond and help her and the team and help her build out Mayyim Hayyim. And we used our intuition as much as we could. And our intuition was to ask people questions. So that's lucky. I was 42 when I started OneTable, with now 20 years of professional experience and this new vocabulary around design thinking. And I am not in any way, shape, or form my target population. OneTable is really designed to support this population of people between undergraduate education and having children. And obviously that spans a broad population, and you need to break that down. But let's just say generally 20s and 30s, which is also, because we're in 2016, generally referred to as millennials. So I'll use those terms somewhat interchangeably. But the idea is, I know what I need on Friday night, but I am not who I'm designing for. So our first hire at OneTable was Jamie Batesh, who is a market researcher, who was in the target population herself. So she could go to dinners on Friday nights in supper clubs, in restaurants, in people's homes, dinners that were identified as Shabbat, dinners that weren't, and start finding out, what are people doing? And we ended up identifying a whole team of observers who could fit into the population that they were observing. So if they needed to be Russian speaking, or gay men, or Upper East Siders, right? Like, they needed to sort of disappear in, and then would let us know. We talk about, well, what was the role of the host? What's the role of the guest? And then a whole other set of questions with people who aren't engaging necessarily in a dinner, in a sort of official dinner on Friday night, and find out what they're looking for. And what we found was fascinating. In their early 20s, they lived sort of a very similar life to they did in college. So they might have dinner with friends, maybe with a whole spread from Trader Joe's, and they can even do blessings sometimes, but then they're going to go out. They're not going to have dinner as their whole night. So we want to be sure that we're not setting up a model where Friday night dinner is only, you sit down at 7 o'clock and then you're there at the table till 11. In fact, they don't have tables. So ixnay on that. We're called OneTable because it's kind of a helpful, catchy term, but to sit around a table with matching plates, and it feels like you're playing house at a certain age, right? So great. So let's make sure again that the way in which we're communicating reflects the needs. Then as people are getting closer to 30, they just kept talking about how tired they were, so tired, exhausted. So when Friday night comes, is there a way to have prepared foods already? And maybe I have just 8 or 9 people, and maybe 5 or 6, and I have a glass of wine, and that is my night. I'm not going out. No way am I going out afterward, right? And then we get into couples who, as we know, want to be with other couples, right? And then there gets great. People start thinking about, whether they're having children and who are they with and what are those needs. And it definitely became clear that once you're having kids, Friday night dinner takes on a whole other experience, and that becomes a sort of clearly beyond our scope. Then there's this whole world of technology that was not there even 3 years ago that makes it easier for people to get together. So let's use it. So for the first year and a half, we built on top of Feastly, which is a social dining platform, just like Airbnb for food, right? So the idea is Dan's going to host a dinner in his house. He creates a host profile. He sets a menu. He may even set a price if he needs money to help pay for it. And people can sign up, his friends, his guests, friends of friends, maybe even randoms. And they can register online. He can say, yeah, you can totally come in, or, he can approve who comes and doesn't. And then I have all of this data about who's going to what dinners, when they're a guest, when they're a host. It's already set up. I can have a business-to-business relationship between OneTable and, let's say, Instacart, which provides on-demand grocery delivery, or Seamless or Grubhub, which provides restaurants. It's so easy to make the technical pieces we can answer. So if I don't have time to cook, solved. That is an easy one. Your anxiety is a different one. That one I think is going to take a conversation and some coaching. But okay, so we could do that. And so we've taken this very individual spin, I think my Shabbat coaches are kind of the mikveh guides, but also the dinner hosts are kind of the mikveh guides. In our case, the dinner hosts themselves are volunteers, and they're responsible for creating a beautiful experience for their guests so that their guests feel like, oh, this was so good, I want more of it in my life. Because ultimately, we're not interested in people doing Shabbat once. We really want this to become a practice in people's lives. And so that is just a whole different design challenge and so much more fun.
And why do you want it to be a practice in people's lives? Like, you're not coming from a religious denominational organization here. You're just devoted to this one practice of having Shabbat dinners regularly, I guess, right? So what is the sort of theory here? What is the motivation? What is the idea about why this is important?
And maybe also in your answer, you can give a quick overview of what OneTable is for listeners who might not have heard much about it.
OneTable is an online and in-person hub and platform for young adults to create micro communities around the Shabbat dinner table, ultimately building a lifelong practice. What that looks like is sort of like an Airbnb for Shabbat dinner. We've created an opportunity for people all over the country to apply, to say Shabbat dinner is something I want to try or is important to me, and this is why. There's a brief application for hosts, and they create an online posting for their event based on the city they're in and the food they would like to serve and whether this is a dinner with lots of ritual or a little bit of ritual, but they as the host have total control and can create the environment. They can then select whether it's a totally private dinner, they just want to have friends and get together mostly because they're new to hosting, whether they'd love to have people open up and be able to just say yes or no to anyone, or whether they're absolutely open to having anybody at their table. Most of the dinners that are open for OneTable tend to take place in a public space, in a park or a beach, and often in smaller towns where the opportunity to go to a Shabbat dinner with other young adults is few and far between, so they tend to be more open and even more welcoming. Since OneTable started just 2 years ago, there have been well over 30,000 seats at the table, well over 2,300 dinners, and each week it grows. Literally, there's a week-over-week growth, which says to me that there is a tremendous interest and need in this kind of creation of a gathering and support. And if we provide the platform and the support that hosts need to achieve this and then get out of the way, then you see a tremendous explosion of creativity.
Great. Going back to Dan's question before, what is it about Shabbat dinners in particular that are so important for us to have in our lives?
Every week there is more research about the epidemic of loneliness and disconnection, particularly among millennials. It's actually higher among millennials right now than any other population. A lot of assumption is that it's probably based on technology and based on how much our faces are in our phones as opposed to engaging with others. And the loneliness leads to lots of other things like high stress and pain and suffering. The desire to connect with other people in real life is important and easily articulated, but for some reason there is often a barrier between the desire for it and the ability to actually do it. OneTable, by focusing on Shabbat dinner as a place to not have a kind of a personal meditative escape from the week, but actually as an opportunity to engage in conversation, in real life, face-to-face conversation and communication and eating together, has an important value, right, that actually meets the needs of a population who is feeling disconnected from each other, to actually give them the tools and resources to connect. That's one of the deep ancient values inherent in Shabbat, that it can be a separate elevated space, that Kedusha, the holiness or the sanctity of this time, can actually elevate and create community. There are so many. I have a long list of the sort of the Jewish values behind why OneTable functions and focuses explicitly on Shabbat dinner. But the most fundamental is that interpersonal connection, and it comes up in every time we do a survey or evaluation or interview. Above anything else is the relationship piece, is the face-to-face connection piece. And it's different than happy hour at a bar. It's different than being at an audience, sitting next to somebody and viewing something. It's actually around the table, and it creates the foundation for a lifelong practice. So as someone who has never missed a Friday night dinner in her life, I can tell you that the way in which I've related to that ritual has been very different when I was a child, when I was a teen, when I was a young person, when I was in college, when I was traveling around and backpacking and meeting people in different cultures, when I began figuring out, finding my life partner and determining who makes a good dinner party, and now my role as a parent. And I love the idea that this ritual is really something that I can access at different stages of my life and different places and different styles. It's portable, comes with me wherever I go. And I want to be able to provide access to that to people for whom it's foreign. So I think there has tremendous personal, physical, psychological benefit, as well as the sense of belonging that many of us are looking for, as well as the skills and talent to actually cook and serve and enjoy a meal, as well as kedusha, as well as a moment of sanctity and humility. So the other beauty of Shabbat, aside from the fact that it's there, it's ours for our whole lives, and by the way, every single week, because we need it that much. But it's also an elevated and sanctified time that's beyond our own control. So most of us no longer know what like Thursday night television is, right? We time shift everything. We make things, we work when it makes sense to us, we exercise when it makes sense, we eat when it makes sense, we do all these things like when it best fits our personal needs. But Shabbat is dictated beyond us. It starts Friday night, whether or not we are kind of in the right place or mind. And I think that offers this wonderful relief and humility that we need, that we can't actually control all of this. And to just submit for a little while is a relief, and it gives us the opportunity to then replenish our souls and our egos to start again the next week.
It's really fascinating to me, just listening to you describe some of these things, in that I'm hearing kind of two different things going on at the same time, which I think is really natural, and I think it's really what's going on in a lot of this, which is on the one hand, this notion that we have a particular way of doing things, right? So like Friday night dinner should be on Friday night. We actually had a fascinating conversation with Vanessa Oakes where we were talking about the idea of moving Jewish holidays around, that some people are having Purim a few days later because it's more convenient to do it on Shabbat, or there was an article about people having Passover Seders over the weekend because it's a more convenient time to gather the family. And, that seems in tension with a kind of Jewish notion of how time is particularly privileged and particularly sacred, and you can't move the day of a holiday. And one of the things that we talked about was, but in America, holidays are actually defined by being the long weekend that's closest to the time on the month that they usually are. So in a way, it's kind of an American way of thinking about holidays that's different from the traditional Jewish way of thinking about holidays. And it's interesting to see those two come into contact with one another and sort of which one gives. At the same time, you're also talking about doing this market research and being happy that we didn't end up talking about it in terms of sunset, because that would have not worked well for our population. And yet I think a lot of traditionalists kind of hear that and say, sort of similar to what we say about politics, we don't need to have a market-driven Judaism, that somehow cheapens it, or, Judaism is a thing and it's not about what people, and yet I think that ultimately what you're describing in terms of design thinking is that it really is, it's both, right? I mean, it's saying that ultimately this Jewish stuff has to be in the service of people, and also maybe even larger ideals, like you talked about, making the world a better place, and at the same time, it is a particular set of things, right? I mean, it does have a past. It does have and I would say more than a past, it has a perspective, right? I mean, it says we do think that this notion that water can transform us and create a rebirth is a powerful idea. And so maybe it's not quite working in the packaging that we've had it, but that doesn't mean that we should change and see, well, maybe air can do that too, saying, no, let's figure out how to make the water work better, right? Or whatever. So I think it's really interesting what you're doing and how you're describing it, and having our listeners sort of hear all the different perspectives. And I mean, I'm sort of wondering, maybe in closing, if you could reflect a little bit, as you started to do, about who you are as an innovator, meaning you talked about being from a long line of Reform rabbis. I'm also thinking about your being a woman, and so many of the innovators that are doing some of the really most interesting stuff in the Jewish world today are women. And I'm wondering, are there other characteristics that basically we should be paying more attention to than we are, which are saying, if we're looking for the people who are going to be the ones who are really going to be able to play with this stuff. And you also talked about not being part of the population that you're working on behalf of. And I'm wondering, too, is that actually a good thing? Meaning, is that something that we should be actively pursuing to say, hey, we want to take people who have strong Jewish backgrounds, who are women, who are actually from a different generation, but somehow, get them to understand design thinking in a deep way, and then kind of immerse them in a completely different population. And that would be a way where, some of the most interesting creativity could happen. Or are there other factors that you think might actually be able to contribute to an atmosphere where, it wouldn't only be Aliza Kline kind of going around from one ritual to another and blowing them up, but that actually there would be kind of a whole cadre of people like that?
Oh, you just asked me so many things.
We're running out of time, so I want to get all my questions in.
I know. I mean, I feel like, we're not reinventing ritual. Here's what's an interesting thing, right? We did not fundamentally change the ritual of mikveh, as you said. We were quite clear, like it is a kosher mikveh, and you can use it for the most traditional purposes, or the most, I don't know what the non-traditional, the most contemporary, most interesting, or let's just go with contemporary. And when we got to Friday night dinner, by the way, we're not reinventing Friday night dinner and Shabbat dinner. Like, when we asked people what their associations were with it, guess what they said? Challah. Guess what our logo is? It's a challah, right? It's an artistic rendering of one, but that's because it makes people feel good. Sunset triggered them, so I'm not going to use it. It is not about not wanting it to be aspirational and for people to think more and more about what this can add to their lives. But in order to get people in the door, they can't feel like an idiot first, right? They need to feel competent first and invited. So that, I think, is a big thing. Look, the beauty of getting older is more and more comfort with gray and nuance. That is one of the most interesting things that I see is very different from some of my younger staff and our constituents, from other people that I'm working with, right? They are passionate and curious, but sometimes sort of startlingly more black and white. Even though everything I said before about how we have multiple nuances, but it's either going to be religious or it's not, right? Like, a little bit is still kind of funky. And I'll probably get in trouble if I say anything about this in terms of the gender piece, but I would say I describe myself at the beginning as saying I'm driven by ritual, right? And I am certainly not anti-intellectual. God forbid. I just know that what gets my juices flowing is a little bit different. I love, if I'm sitting with a learning partner in Chavruta and we have just explored a text and we come to a new realization, that can get my heart beating fast too. But when given the choice, I go to the emotional. Is that, and I do think that my being a woman that's probably connected to that. Maybe I simply had more permission growing up to go to the emotional first, right? I remember the conversations I had with my mom were different than those with my dad around preparing for Shabbat. Right? My mom was new to Jewish ritual and Jewish practice, and for her, it was incredibly emotional, right? The work that went into setting the table with a white tablecloth and fresh flowers, that act was just as important as any blessings that were said. And that was, she taught me, and I'm the kid who set the table. And if you come to my dinner tonight, you will see a white tablecloth with the same Kiddush cup. There are certain of these blessings and rituals and experiences that I think do get passed down in our heritage. And it's fundamentally, though, about the way it feels. And I think that is something that I and others can bring to this, right? Is a willingness to give weight and power to the emotional piece. It's what drives us, it's what catalyzes our memories, helps us be creative and curious. It's an emotional thing, and I think that is what can get, when, you have to soften things. I remember this when I was first studying mikveh. I had a very powerful experience as a bride in a lake, but when I got the job at Mayyim, I thought I'd better know even more, and I started exploring monthly immersion, and I went to the mikveh, and I also read whatever I could. So in that case, I was sort of new to tradition, and often people who are new tradition become even more observant. And there was a fabulous article written by Naomi Marmon-Grummet where she interviewed all these people about the way they practice this one ritual of immersion in a mikveh following their period before having sex with their husbands. And everybody did it differently. During the period of separation from their spouse, some people held hands, some people didn't. Some people slept in pajamas in the same bed, some people didn't. Some people had twin beds. Like, some people held hands on the roof, but not inside. Everybody did it differently because it's private and it's personal. And it gave me so much permission. So I like candles the way I like candles. You may not like candles at all. That's okay. I think that permission is also something that I feel is not only my right, but my obligation to share, right? That the ritual, our history, our culture is strong and sturdy and robust and resonant. And because of that, you have permission to make it your own. I want you to own it. And that, I think, is, I don't know if that's because of my gender or my age or my intuition or my experience, but it's definitely my passion.
Well, I think it represents a really interesting perspective. A lot of the concern that a lot of our organizations have, and I think it has to do with some kind of worry that people aren't buying the whole package, and that's somehow that's a problem. And, and yet, what I hear you talking about is that fundamentally this is in the service of people, that they have the ownership and the power and the privilege to take this stuff and do what they will with it. And maybe what I'm hearing from you is some kind of trust in humanity that if we can only get this stuff into the hands of people, they're not going to screw it up. They're not going to waste it. They're actually going to make something out of it. And we don't know what that's going to be. But the problem that we're facing is that the people aren't playing with this stuff. They're alienated from it. It's not that we're trying to persuade them to do it a certain way. It's that we're trying to hand this to them in a way that they don't have it. I mean, is that a way that you see this? Or how do you describe what it is that you're... Because on the one hand, I hear you saying that you're wanting people to engage with these rituals that you think are really great. On the other hand, you're saying that you're very comfortable with them being played around with and changed. And you're not coming at this like a Jewish legal thinker saying this is the right way to do it. And it's very important to God that they be done in this precise way. And yet you're also saying, but we want people to be doing this on Friday night, right? We want people to be doing this in water. So I don't know, is there a way in which you see that space, which is really what we aspirationally should be trying to make happen in the Jewish world or in the world of Jews today?
So I'm a religious person. I'm really comfortable with that language. I really wish more people were. I think that religion provides a framework for my life that helps me know how to respond to the person asking for money on the subway, helps me be a better partner and parent and friend, helps me be more ethical as an employer. It helps me know that I need to take care of my body. There are just so many places where I, as a person, need guidance. I need support beyond myself. I need history. I need to belong to something. All of those things are pretty fundamental to me, and I'm fairly confident that I'm not the only one. And I learn more and more that I'm not, because I spend a lot of time asking people what they need and find out that there are in some cases very similar, sometimes very different. But the reason I've spent my career sort of working for the Jews is that that's my religion. So that's the place where I can make the most impact and where I am closest to seeing the need and where I am most connected to people who have these needs but don't yet realize that they have a resource that's right there for them. And so if I can open that up, if I can say you have access and you have permission, that's Dayenu. Like, that's pretty good. I think that helps me sleep at night. I am scared about our world. I'm raising 3 children, and I don't know how to answer questions for them a lot. They're scared, and I hate that they're scared. And so Shabbat is a reprieve, but also I can do my best to pass on ethical teachings to them that were passed on to me. And I there have a resource. Like, I'm not alone. I'm not the only parent dealing with these things. And I have the sayings of our ancestors that can guide. Like, I have wells. And I feel like it's unfair for people who don't have access to those resources. They're on their own. And in fact, people who are part of my tribe, my ever-growing and ever-evolving tribe, do have these resources. How can I help them access them?
Wow. That's an important note to end on and a helpful reminder for those of us who are working in the Jewish world regarding why we do what we do. Thanks to Aliza Kline for coming on to this episode of Judaism Unbound. I think I speak for both Dan and I, and hopefully our listeners, when I say that as much as we don't necessarily think of you as a traditional artist with paintbrush and canvas or something like that, hearing you speak about design thinking and the creativity that goes into your work now at OneTable and in the past at Mayyim Hayyim is a real testament to the broad definition of art and artists that hopefully we can work with in the Jewish world. And we want to close out the episode, as always, by letting folks know how they can be in touch with us. So the first way is you can be in touch on Facebook at our page called Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our website, www.judaismunbound.com, and you can reach us via email. And our addresses are lex@nextjewishfuture.org and dan@nextjewishfuture.org. And the last piece is that we would love to encourage you to go to our Patreon page. That's where you can make a small monthly contribution to Judaism Unbound and help us keep doing what we do. And the website for that is www.patreon.com. That's patreon.com/Judaism Unbound. So with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.